Welcome, everybody. I'm Karen Panetta, and I'm honored to be here today to host this X Factor conversation with Dr. Robert Kahn. So let's welcome Robert to the stage.
Okay.
We need your camera back on. There you are. There you are.
Well, I didn't actually do it before.
There you go. Dr. Kahn, welcome. And first, I have to say congratulations on being the IEEE 2024 Medal of Honor recipient.
Hey, thank you so much. It was a great honor to learn about it. You know, I've been an IEEE member since it was before IEEE, like IRE maybe, early 1960s, so it's a long time.
Did you join as a student member?
Yeah, I'm sure I did.
That's awesome. Yes, and they actually count the years of membership, including your student membership, on your card. So it always makes us look older than we are when we get our membership cards. But we're here today to talk about your amazing career, your exemplary work, and the tremendous impact that you've had on humanity. So we're going to look at past, the future, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the present. So the first thing I wanted to ask you was just to give us a little background on the way you got interested in this field, and I want to know that like pivotal moment where you're like, I really need to do this. This is something that I just think you just called it the raging river that floated you away here into this topic.
Well,
so can you background on that?
That was a conversation we had a little earlier, but that was about the internet piece of the puzzle and then all its logical extensions and follow-ons. But my career has had a number of different paths. I started out my career at Bell Laboratories when most of the people who had graduated from school went into the hardcore technology areas like color television, phase lock loops, coding, modulation theory, that sort of stuff. I opted to go into headquarters of Bell Labs, where they were into a math research group that was responsible for sort of orchestrating the overall architecture of the Bell system. And that stood me in very good stead going forward because it gave me kind of an insider view of how to think about architecture nationally. Mm-hmm. And the national networks we really had at that time were very few, like the Bell system was certainly one of them. That was a great introduction. But from there, I went on. I was on the faculty at MIT, got a PhD at Princeton along the way. And, my career eventually veered from communications arena and analog signals into computing. And I ended up at DARPA, which is a major organization that not only funded some of the early work on networking and from where we made the internet happen, but I got very deeply involved in the computer science. So this kind of all evolved little by little. It wasn't like one aha moment where I said, I can see my whole future and that's what I want to do. It wasn't anything like that at all.
That's interesting because a lot of students, they have good vision of where they want to be and what they want to do. And what you're talking about is that there's all these diverging paths, and you take one step at a time, and you end up in a different place that helps steer you somewhere else. What made you even want to go to MIT first? Like, of course, I know everybody wants to go to MIT, but why into education? Why not go directly into industry? What was the motivation for that?
I think my family was always interested in education. It was kind of a scholarly environment in many ways. My dad was a high school principal in Brooklyn, New York, where I grew up originally. And I think, it had always been pretty clear to me that I was going to go on to college, and teaching just seemed like the natural thing. I love to deal with kids. I love to, explain things and the like. And it was also an opportunity to work on interesting research challenges. What serendipity sometimes plays a major role in how your life unfolds. You know, like, you know, when I got married, it wasn't like I had a plan for what to do. I wasn't even thinking about it. I happened to meet my wife on an airplane, just by happened to sit next to this very interesting lady. Changed the big course of my life by serendipity. When I was at MIT, actually, I originally thought I might want to go to a smaller school. Um, and as I looked around the smaller schools, it turns out that, they didn't really have a lot of research funding. So the odds of really being able to bring in substantial amounts of research money or do substantial things just seemed small. So I ended up, going and applying to MIT, see if there was anything there, and one or two other places along the way. And the MIT folks at the time said, well, all their slots for the next year are filled because I was late in sending in the application. But they said, why don't you come up and just come say hello? So I did. They paid my way up there, and next thing I know, they said, well, guess what? We found an open slot. And so I ended up saying, great. I don't know what I would have done otherwise.
That changed everything. Wow, that's an amazing story.
That put me into MIT, and while I was there, I was the youngest one on the faculty. But it turns out that everyone else that was up there had more experience with real things than I did. I was more of a mathematician and not a closet mathematician. That's what I worked on, mathematical problems. I mainly, delved into them pretty deeply. And the fellow who ran the group up, it was a very impressive group. I mean, it had not only Irwin Jacobs was on the faculty, but it was run by a fellow named Jack Wozencraft, who I got very well. Irwin and Jack wrote the key textbook in communications, which was Wozencraft and Jacobs. Next to Jack's office was Claude Shannon, who's well known for information theory. And Bob Gallagher, who was another Medal of Honor winner from, 1990 or something, like 30 some odd years ago.
Erwin Jacobs is also a Medal of Honor winner. So yes, you come from good academic genes.
Well, you probably can't give it to Claude Shannon anymore because I think you don't get the award posthumously. Is that right?
No, we don't. We do not. No, the Medal of Honor is given. It's the IEEE's highest recognition, and until up to this year, it's always been for a single individual, which has made it difficult because I think that you are going to talk a lot about the teamwork, or at least I'm going to ask about the collaborations and teamwork that it took to achieve such great milestones. And because of that, IEEE has now changed the Medal of Honor so new applications can be for teams.
Wow,
so
that's great.
Yeah, that's going to be awesome.
So anyway, I decided, I used to show up in his office periodically. His door was always open. And he was kind of mentoring me a little bit. And I would say 80% of the time, he never looked up from his desk when I was there. I mean, he was doing what he was doing, and I was trying to get his attention. And every now and then, he'd get up on the board ferociously and be working with me on some problem. And I one day just screwed up my courage. And I said, can I ask you a personal question? Why is it that this happens? And he says, look, the math problems you bring are always really, really interesting. But he says, if I don't know what to do with the answer to the question that you're posing, it's hard for me to get motivated. But I said, well, how do you know? He said, it's experience. So he said, I'll make a gratuitous comment back. He says, what you should do, I didn't know whether this was a positive or a negative comment at the time, but he said, you ought to take a leave of absence, go apprentice yourself to somebody who knows how to deal with real things, and then come on back to the faculty. And I just took it at face value and said, okay, do you have any suggestions? And he had a few. One of them was go to Lincoln Labs, where I think he had spent some time. That's a part of IT that's more focused on defense things. And they were in a hiring freeze, so that was not a possibility then. Another one was BB&N, where I eventually went. But the whole goal was get some practical experience. And so while I was there, I started to work on networking when almost everybody in the field thought I was throwing my career away. That's tough to believe, but there were very few commercial firms that had interactive time-sharing computers. And so for a major company wanting to get into the field, if you had only 10 or 20 companies that could use your services, that's not a business.
Yes, yes.
And so, you know, I I was kind of, a little bullheaded at the time, and I said, well, that's what I'm really interested in. So let me go work on that, and that's what I did. Then I learned that there was this organization in Washington called it's called ARPA at the time. Later became DARPA when they put D for defense in front of it. And the fellow who was running that group, who later ended up at Xerox PARC, along with many of the other people at BB&N that I worked with, basically said you ought to send the reports you're writing. I've written a stack of reports, so I don't know, 6, 8 inches high, various interesting topics: routing, flow control, buffer control, congestion control, and send them to those guys that might be interested. So I did, and DARPA said, "Oh, why don't you come down and pay us a visit?" Which I then did, not thinking that that was going to change my career in any significant way. But next thing I know, about a year later, there's an RFQ that comes out of the government. They want somebody to build a 4-node network. And I came to me, it showed up on my desk at BB&N. I looked at it and I said, oh my goodness, this is exactly what I've been working on. Somebody's really interested. I think that's great.
Well, you said, wait a minute, you said that showed up on your desk. Are you sure they didn't use your documents as the RFQ to develop it?
No, there were parts of my documents that were in there. Like if you looked at the air control pictures in my reports, those were literally copied and pasted into the other two. But I mean, I was fine with that because my view was, look, I've now made something real happen. This is not just a theoretical math problem I'm working on. This is going to happen real. But it never dawned on me at that point that I'd actually be involved, because I was thinking of going back to MIT. As it turned out, Jack was serious when he told me to take the leave. He meant for me to come back. But, I just found myself in a point where, a fellow who was good at building things shows up in my office one day and he says, I understand you have an RFQ from DARPA. Can I see it? And I said, who are you? And he said who he was, and it turns out he was prepared to run a group to actually build it, but they didn't know much about the networking piece of it, which I did. Mm-hmm. So I ended up going over there. We ended up building the network. It took a few years, and we were so successful. We did a demo of it that in the Washington Hilton, and at the end of '72, DARPA said, why don't you come down? I ended up running the office down there. But that was in networking. And when I went, I said, look, I think I should do something different. And so they were going to set up a program of automated manufacturing. Mm-hmm. It was really interesting to me, just change the way manufacturing works, distributed computing, artificial intelligence. I mean, the whole nine yards, put it all together. And then Congress canceled the program. And so I thought, well, I don't think this is going to work. Maybe I should go back to MIT. And I got persuaded to stay. And I ended up designing a few other nets. One of them is really interesting. I worked with Irwin Jacobs and a few other people on designing a satellite net to Europe so we could link with the European researchers. I ended up designing, Irwin ended up being most well known for his work on cellular telephony and the CDMA technologies, spread spectrum. But I ended up designing in DARPA a net called packet radio that was based on those same principles, direct sequence spread spectrum, and we built it. Those radios were like, a cubic foot in size. You couldn't fit it in your shirt pocket. They weighed 70 pounds. You couldn't. They were luggable, I would say, rather than portable. But we actually used it. It was used in certain military. I think it was used in Desert Storm, in Iraq.
Were you excited then when CMOS technology came out, that you could then miniaturize all these circuitry?
I never got involved in the miniaturization of the circuitry for that. That was pure industrial from other people. Qualcomm did it. I sat on their board for many years, so I was involved in what they were doing, but I wasn't driving it. But I was driving the packet radio network program, and what the hardest part of that was figuring out how to make it convenient to do spread spectrum on in a small footprint. And so we ended up funding Texas Instruments to build those on surface acoustic wave chips. But the other thing is there had never been I mean, to my knowledge, certainly nothing commercial that was a radio that was controlled digitally. They were all electronics, top to bottom. And when I started the program, Intel had just introduced their Intel 4004.
Mm-hmm.
Very first, wasn't big enough to do anything really useful. With 4 bits, I mean, what could you have? 2 bits for buffers? It's like 4 of them. I mean, you have 4 instructions. It just wasn't sufficient. But by the time we got closer to deploying the program, starting it up for real rather than just studying what to do, they had introduced the Intel 8008, the first 8-bit micro. And I was still thinking that's too small. They hadn't introduced the 8080 yet. That was later. But the 8-bit 8008 probably wouldn't have hacked it. But just when I had to flip the switch and say go on the program, National Semiconductor introduced their National IMP16, which is the very first 16-bit micro.
Oh, yes,
It was a hard micro to use, but it functioned. I mean, it had the functionality. So we built that. And that's where the internet program came from, the linking of those nets. Ben had just finished his PhD at UCLA, and he went to Stanford on the faculty, and I got him involved with what we were doing. And, together we fleshed out, I had many ideas about how this would work architecturally. He had been very involved in building the original ARPANET protocols for the host machines. I didn't know much about computers or operating systems at the time, and I learned. It was a very quick study.
You learned, that's right. That's what I'm going to say. You jumped right in and learned.
And we did. In fact, the way the internet really propagated was we funded a gentleman named Bill Joy who had been at Berkeley, and he was building a virtual memory version of Unix. And I got Bill to put the TCP/IP protocols into Unix, which made it propagate, because most people in the community, and certainly in the research community, weren't thinking about how do I get on the ARPANET. They were thinking about how to get more computing power. And so they all wanted this virtual memory Unix system because it could use large amounts of memory for, VLSI processing or image understanding, the things that required a lot of memory. And when they got this virtual memory Unix system, on the BCD tape out of Berkeley came the TCP/IP protocol. So whether they were thinking about it or not, they suddenly became internet compatible with everybody else. And then industry came on. IBM put it into their 3016 machine. DEC put it on with help from BB&N on their PDP-10 series. And so a lot of that was, probably a little bit accidental, but mostly planned.
So you brought up so many great points. You've talked about mentorship, and it sounds like you sought out your own mentor, or you just showed up in his office and you were fortunate enough that you found someone to mentor you. The second thing is the connection to the real world. I can't tell you how many times academic folks get very upset when they say, well, the real world. They say, well, what's the real world? And we try to say, well, we need something that can be commercialized, or something that can, be a product and impact lives, because we want to transition the fundamental research to something that people understand. And so today we have internships and co-op opportunities. And it sounds like, that from the very beginning, that connection to the real world or to making impact was always there, just implemented in a different way for you. And you had to see it.
Well, I think it really showed up after my conversation with Jack Rosencraft that caused me to take a leave of absence, go get some practical experience. And I thought practical experience was figuring out what a network should look like. It never occurred to me to actually be involved in building it, but I was. And it was not without its tensions, because, I would have to write a document to describe how something was going to happen before the guys who were going to build it were ready for it. And they thought they should be doing it, but they didn't have time to do it. And so we had to kind of sort that out, but it worked out okay in the final analysis. But, and so while I was at DARPA, I spent a lot of time on new networks and how to interconnect them. That's where the internet really came from. And at some point, I want to fast forward to what I've been doing in the last 30 some odd years, because I've been worrying about where the internet goes from here. And it started with another collaboration that Bit and I had on mobile programs in the internet. mainly smart mobile programs, which we called knowledge robots or nobots.
Mhm.
But let me go back again to the time at DARPA. Hopefully, we'll come back to this and tell you that it seems strange to people because I mean, here's a DARPA program that people are still very well aware of 50 years after the fact. That's a rarity. I mean,
Yes.
I mean, most of those programs show the feasibility of something and it goes away. I mean, the ARPANET was decommissioned in 1990, so it doesn't exist anymore other than as a demonstration that packet switching can work. Well, it's now
Mhm.
done by industry, but that program, went away. But what happened with the internet program is it's lasted. I mean, here it is, 50 years out, and I mean, I met with some people the other day that said, it could last easily another 50 or 100 years because there are
Mhm.
no ideas that are out there that's going to change globally everything that everybody does. When you got 3 billion people around the world involved in something, or maybe it's 4 billion by now, it's very hard to change everything. And many of them aren't even interested in changing because they don't have the resources to do it or whatever. They barely got to where they currently are. When you take a look at all of these things and kind of wonder, you think it must have been a no-brainer back then. The answer is it wasn't, because
Yeah.
North had exactly the philosophy that you're describing.
Mhm.
Build things that are going to be important to defense. That was their
Mhm.
mission. It was the
Mhm.
result of the Soviet launch of Sputnik back in the late 50s. Maintain a technological vigil for the country. That was their
That's right.
goal.
That's right. And
Yeah.
so, and you're talking about this, you mentioned just now that, let's talk about the future or what you're worried about now. And you mentioned AI back in the 60s and 70s, and
Yeah.
AI is nowhere what it is today.
DARPA
So
was
can
doing it.
we talk about artificial intelligence and like, what are you looking at? And what do you think of,
Yeah.
all right, no explainability, and we've got, generative AI.
Be happy to. I just want to tie a bow on the topic that we were just talking about. You would think that it would have been obvious to anybody this is a good thing to do, but it wasn't at DARPA because think about 1972 3 timeframe. The
Mhm.
military had no computers. The typical DARPA mantra was find a problem that the military services have. It could be an abstract problem or a real one they have and go solve it.
Mhm.
They didn't have this problem. They didn't have any computers, so they didn't need any networks to connect to the computers that they didn't have.
Mhm.
And when the internet came along, they didn't have a need for an internet to connect the networks together that they didn't have to the computers together that they didn't have. And so I almost think it wasn't until COVID showed up many years later that people suddenly said, hey, this is really important. I mean, how
Mhm.
would we have gotten through COVID without something like the internet?
But
I mean,
we would absolutely would not have, and we still now see the limitations, right? I mean, it was like,
it
wow.
came later. It came later.
Yep.
Well, okay, so here's another part of it. So I ran the office for quite a while, probably the longest serving director of that office, even
Mhm.
today. Because DARPA has a policy, bring people in and, cycle them out because, with youth comes new good ideas. Well, I seem to have a wellspring of good ideas for my whole career because that's what we're still doing. But when we got there, a lot of people in the field were interested in sort of what AI can do, and it had its ups and downs. There was an AI winter in the mid 1980s, and there's an academy up in the Boston area called the America. It's got the same acronym as AAAS in Washington. It's
Mhm.
AAAS in Boston, American uh, Academy of Arts and Sciences. The other one's for the advancement of science. Anyway, they publish a magazine called Daedalus, and they decided to produce a version on artificial intelligence, and they did something like 1987. I had just left DARPA at that point and started the organization I now run called CNRI. And we were focused on kind of helping to foster innovation for the national information infrastructure. It was a term I had coined. Very hard sell. And we can get into that if you want, because you have to imagine, you have to visualize what informational infrastructure is. And for people to put money into something that they can't kick the tires of is really
Yeah,
hard.
that's right. So communications and being able to tell that compelling story is instrumental. It's a skill. It's an actual skill.
That's why we couldn't get a program on the internet in the early days. It was you couldn't visualize what it was and who it was for and so forth. Anyway,
Mhm.
so the editor of the magazine called me. It's a very prestigious magazine they produce, and he said, "We'd like you to write an article on artificial intelligence." And I wasn't an AI researcher at the time, and even though we've been funding most of the best AI researchers in the country, and I said, "You go and ask the people who are working in the field. This is their field. Let them write about it. This is not my field. I'm just, I fund good proposals, but that's it." There were some other things where I'm an innovator, and networking was one of them, but not here. Um, so they called me back and said, "No, no, 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 no. We need you to write a paper. You can write on anything you like, but you got to write a paper. Everybody's saying you got to write a paper." So I said, "All right, if you're really giving me carte blanche," and I actually wrote a paper that they didn't accept. They told me I could write on anything I want. It was entitled "Artificial Intelligence: The Reality and the Myth," and I tried to distinguish what was real from what was hype back in the
I think
second.
we need, I was going to say, I think we need another one of those versions of that paper today.
Well, when they had a meeting of like 30 people on their review panel. When you chair a review panel for awards, this was like their awards, who the papers are going to be. And so there's like 30 people from around the country there. And I showed up and they all said, "That's not the paper we were expecting." And I said, "I was told I could write about anything I want." They said, erroneously, "We understand that you masterminded this whole program," which is not true. "And therefore, we want to understand what your game plan was." And I said, "I didn't have a game plan. My plan was to fund the best proposals we got. And we could tell people what areas we were interested in, like expert systems or artificial intelligence applied to speech understanding or image
Mhm.
processing, whatever." But our job, and it wasn't only me, there were many other people involved, was to evaluate them, fund the best of the proposals, and let the community that knows about this. They didn't believe me. They're not telling us candid
But doesn't
story.
it, but doesn't that tell you that the way the thinking was so rigid that this is the process that you get to innovation and that you really
No,
were thinking? I
I'm not
mean,
sure. I'm not sure it was rigid. I just think they gave me more credit than there are things that I'm happy to take credit for if I've really been involved in doing them.
mhm.
The Academy Medal of Honor is one. I'm happy to take credit for what you honored me for. Because I was really involved in that, and Vint and I did amazing work together over many years. But artificial intelligence is one I thought about a lot. I spent time with, but and what can I
I mean,
say?
and I asked Vint the same sort of question when I interviewed him. I said, if you knew about like how the internet today would be misused with and the need for cybersecurity, do you think that you could have thought about or did you even think about that back then when you were creating?
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things I've been most concerned about, from day one was what could go wrong. The way you think about infrastructure is by not only what it's trying to accomplish, but how it can become stable and fend off all the possible threats on it.
Mhm,
I mean, I was approached by Tim Berners-Lee, when he was thinking about setting up a web consortium. Wanted to
mhm,
set up and asked if CNRI would be interested. And I had all these questions about many of the things that have gone wrong with it over the years back then.
mhm,
One of the things we started was a program that was a follow-on to the Nobot stuff, where we essentially took the mobility out of mobile programs and created an architecture for more static stuff. People didn't
mhm.
want mobile programs showing up, but okay, if you had repositories and you could put digital objects in those repositories and create metadata, we kind of fleshed that all out. It was a really seminal paper in the digital library field. So we did all that, but there were all these same questions. And one of the questions people would ask is, Well, why do you need a separate identifier system, which we have, so you can identify these objects? If you look at the publishing field, IEEE is one of them. Every IEEE article, and certainly their major publications, proceedings, communications, and the like, you will see something called a digital object identifier. That's the
DOI.
technology. Huh?
DOI.
Well, that's a trademark of the publishers. The term
Oh.
digital object identifier that's a term anybody can use. DOI is a trademark of the publishers who are an early adopter. They wanted to be sure. I'm now getting into the fast forward story, but I'll come back in a second. They want to be sure that if you published a journal digitally, that if you had a reference in the back to an article, that it would have the same longevity as a book might have
Mm-hmm.
on a bookshelf with their card catalogs. Well, if you identify it with something like a URL from the web, there's no guarantee that even the organization is going to be around in 50 years or 100 years. I mean, how many companies in the U.S. survived the first 200 years?
Mm-hmm.
You know, Pony Express in the form of something or other, Western Union. I really don't think that, the concerns they have were short-sighted. They were worried about the long term. So if I get an article and it's got an identifier, but it's now 100 years or 1,000 years from now, how do I be sure that I can access that article? And I said, well, you can't unless somebody's going to manage the articles and make sure they're around. So they adopted. They were an early adopter of that. And it's a really important technology that came out of that. Anyway, let me go backwards. In the case of artificial intelligence, we had a period during the 1970s because of the concern about the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the research community didn't want to have anything to do with the Defense Department back in that period. The concern they had, I think, was partly misplaced, only because the Defense Department was doing what it was being asked to do.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, and today they may get, higher ratings. They didn't get them back then. And so a lot of the funding actually went away because of actions of Congress. And
I mean, because of the public pressure against defense.
The budgets were being approved in different fashion. Like,
Mm-hmm.
when I joined ARPA, they had a certain size research budget, but by the time I became director of the office, that budget had dropped to something like 75% of what it had been before. I mean, it was like 25%. It lost 3/4 of its value because it was put into other things that had more military relevance, shall I say. Not basic research.
Not basic research.
Not as much basic research, so we put it that way. We still had a basic research program, but and a lot of people left the field because of that. So my question was, how do we build up the base in the country? And so we ended up, starting a program on VLSI design, which
Mm-hmm.
I thought was crucial because if the computer science community can't get its hands on the VLSI technology, it's going to be cordoned off from a very important part of our future development. So we put that program in place, and it got us up to maybe 80 or 90% of where we were before, because that was a large program. A lot of good things came out of it, including the ability for the research community to get chip designs fabricated really quickly.
Oh, that's right. That was a game changer for
And
students too.
the system we set up was called Moses, which stood for
Moses. Remember Moses?
Education System, and I funded some folks out at the University of Southern California to build. They're still running it out of there, and it's going pretty strong. We subsequently set up a similar kind of system out of CNRI, the organization I now run, that I set up after I left ARPA, nonprofit, to do the same thing for micromechanical devices. And so we've been running that MEMS technology, and we've been running that now for the last 25 years. Again, supporting the community. It's a different kind of thinking that goes into micromechanical stuff than goes into pure electronics, but a lot of the implementation processes are semiconductor-like. It's all today increasingly nanotechnology. In fact, so we had built up this base in VLSI design, but I was looking to make it bigger. And so I proposed a program that the director of DARPA at the time, who was another MIT person who actually joined the MIT faculty the same year that I did, named Bob Cooper,
Mhm.
had agreed to, and it was called strategic computing. And there's a whole book written on it. You can find it on the internet somewhere. And it's like, 2 or 3 inches thick. And I think it over amplifies the role that I had, because a lot of people were involved in this program too. But the whole goal of that program was to figure out how to leverage the work that had been done on artificial intelligence, which was
Mhm.
mainly research labs. The
Mhm.
Defense Department couldn't take advantage of it. Industry didn't know much about it. And so the whole goal was, let's build a program, we'll amplify the work in the research labs, get industry involved, and produce a tech base that the Defense Department may be able to deal with. That's what we did.
Mhm.
And it was a huge program by DARPA standards. It made us the largest office in DARPA, where before we had been the smallest. We probably would have been the second largest if hadn't we all of that, space-based laser stuff out that they
Mhm.
call the Star Wars program, otherwise known
Yeah.
as the Strategic Defense Initiative, formally. That moved
Mhm.
out of DARPA, but so we became the largest office there, and that was a very important thing. And AI was the focus of that program, although we had to worry about building multiprocessor computers because we didn't have enough power in regular
Mhm.
machines to make it really viable for practical application. So that was a really interesting thing. And I think we did a real service, to not only the research community, but industry at the same time, as well as, of course, the Defense Department. And then when I
Absolutely.
left, and then when I left and started CNRI, I left for really 3 reasons. Number one was I wanted to work on infrastructure. That's what I had. That was my specialty. That was the thing that that, that motivated me internally. I like all of computer science. I like the research. I love dealing with all that. But what came from me internally was mainly infrastructural and architectural things like that. And the Reagan administration had decided that in the mid 1980s this was industrial policy and industry should do it. Well, it's really hard for industry to figure
Anytime.
out how to make infrastructure happen because the large guys want to be involved. They can't agree on which other of the large guys should take the
Mhm.
lead. And so you probably need somebody else to do it anyway. And I thought, okay, maybe if I set up an organization in the private sector, people would trust us enough to do it because we knew industry, we knew academia. I was never able to convince anybody that this was something that needed to be worried about at the federal level. It's coming around. I mean, this has gone full cycle now because I've had discussions with people who I really value their inputs in, and they're now saying, yeah, this is an important problem. We ought to be able to figure it out. And there really needs to be I mean, maybe the government doesn't take the lead, but
Right.
there isn't
But
a, if there isn't an imprimatur from the government to sort of make something happen and bring these organizations together, you're probably not going to make it happen. It won't sustain itself in the long term. And there probably needs to be some government money in, even if it's only a small fraction. And
absolutely. No,
and so,
that's it.
so I set up CNRI and we tried to focus on this. And we did two things. Well, let me finish the other story. Uh, that was one of them. I couldn't really work on what I wanted to. Number two, we were facing some budget cuts in DARPA. There was a bill that got passed in the mid-80s that was pushed by Senators Phil Gramm of Texas and Warren Rudman. I think he was from New Hampshire, if I recall. Graham
Mhm.
Rudman, that ended up reducing the certainly the budget in my old office by almost 50%. And
Wow.
I wasn't prepared to dismantle what I had worked so many years through. I just didn't want to do that. So I thought that's another reason probably for letting somebody else get involved. And the third was increasingly we were seeing more congressionally directed, shall I call it pork, to special schools. I don't know if Tufts got any, but I mean, whoever they were, you know.
Yeah.
So those were the motivations for trying to do it. And we got a lot of private sector help in getting started. I mean, in fact, I remember when we filed for our tax exemption with the IRS, they didn't really believe, since we had some of the major companies supporting us, like IBM and Digital Equipment, Xerox and Bell Atlantic, 9X, the major computer, even Belcore, they couldn't believe that those guys would give us funding if they weren't getting directly out of it. And so they gave me like 2 weeks to come back to them with letters from all these guys saying that the money that they're making available is for the public good, essentially, and that there's nothing in particular they want to get other than what's contemporaneously made available to everybody else. Well, they gave us the approval. We got started. And as I said, one of the first things we worked on was this whole digital library field. And that led into this whole idea of thinking about what the internet could become going forward in the future. And the very first thing, this is something Vint and I worked on, was to try and wean the users from having to have fingers on keyboards and eyeballs on screens 7x24. Interested.
Oh, I still need that. I still need that for my kid.
The whole idea was, well, teach these Nobot programs what it is you want. Let them go do your bidding in the network. They can troll around the network looking at databases, tell you when important things happen that you need to know about, kind of free you up. Well, that idea came out roughly at the same time that the Morris worm had first been introduced, and none of the companies that we talked to wanted any part of somebody else's computer program showing up on their machines.
Right.
So we put it on the back burner. It's still on the back burner, although I think it's getting more interest again. And we focused on, taking the mobility part out. It's like the cryptocurrency guys are taking the paper out of the dollar bill and dealing with it digitally. Well, we were taking the mobility out of mobile programs and trying to get them to work separately. So that's what the digital object architecture is all about. And we got a lot of interest from around the world. But I think a lot of what happened in the strategic computing program really pushed artificial intelligence, but we were very aware of all of these issues and concerns. But sometimes things are hard to deal with. I mean, an equivalent area that showed up in the very early days was security. People have given many, many talks and said, how come you guys, not just me, but everybody else who was involved, weren't interested in security? And we said, you got to be kidding. It was high on our list of things. In fact, it's something I worry about.
It was a defense, right? I mean, it was for DARPA. So, of course.
I worry about it myself. But, security in DARPA means something different than security means, let's say, in your house. I mean, and there are institutional organizations that have to bless what you're doing for it to be considered secure. And, in 1972 and 3, when the ARPANET was coming around, and actually being used, it wasn't clear to those organizations that this was real. Is networking going to be here 2 or 3 years? Is this just a passing fancy? Is it just for the researchers? Can defense ever use it? When it's real, come back and talk to us. So they didn't have the resources to put into this. They helped us a little bit, as it turned out, and I'm thankful for what they did. And then later they got into it when they saw it was real, but it took a while to get there. So the other thing about strategic computing that was really interesting is that my wife is actually, by background, a copyright lawyer. And her expertise was in intellectual property protection. And so when one of the first contract I think I ever had with DARPA, because you couldn't go back to them right away, it's just the perception was all wrong. It was like, 8 years after I left, or 7 years, something like that. And it was to help the university community understand how to get, their reports digitized. And I wasn't interested in one name. Digitizing their stuff was like digging a ditch. Okay, maybe someone got to put it in the ditch, but why? Why are you doing it? And so I said, I'm happy to help you out, because they wanted me to do that, provided that I could do something interesting with the program. So they gave me carte blanche, and I said to DARPA picked the universities to do, and they were the best computer science ones. They certainly top 3 and maybe 5 of the top 6. And they said, you go pick it out. I said to every one of them, look, I'm willing to give you funding to do the digitization that you want, but I want you to come up with a digital library of your own to manage it. What are you going to do with this stuff if you don't have a library? So here we're now 3 or 4 different digital libraries. And what I will worry about is funding research on those things and worrying about managing it and orchestrating it. But we'll also take on the job of worrying about how to deal with intellectual property in this digital world. And that was an expertise my wife brought to the table. We did. And we ended up working with the Library of Congress, where the Copyright Office was. We actually prototyped the system for them.
Was that exciting to you, that piece? Was that the piece that really excited you?
It was absolutely exciting for many reasons. One, if you think about the problem of how do you make multiple digital libraries all work together, that's just like the internet problem at a higher level.
Oh, it is. I never thought of it that way. You're right.
It really is. Instead of just figuring out how do you get a packet from here to there, is how do you get stuff in this informational system to work with this and they can move around and all. We didn't solve every problem, but we tackled a big problem higher. And this is still a big, I wish the whole research community would recognize how important the problem this is today and that we've had a solution out there for some 30, 40 years. I think, like with the internet, it wasn't adopted by industry instantly because it's a big deal. And, they figured eventually if we need something like that, they'll do it and they'll kind of only control it. But in the case of digital information, I think, you got multiple companies, not only in the US, but around the world increasingly. You got Apple and Amazon and Microsoft and Google and, you name it. There are a lot of folks who might, even Facebook and all those other places that would like to own and control this field. And so one way is let it play out, and 50 years from now, we'll figure out how to sort it out. The other way is let's adopt a solution. That's what happened with the internet. They adopted the TCP/IP solution because the market demanded it. The market isn't demanding it in information, but it's really important that it happen downstream. So this is really a very fundamental issue. More and more people are becoming aware of it. I'm seeing it in, I've keynoted multiple, cryptocurrency, blockchain conferences where I'm trying to explain to them, in this digital object stuff, it's very easy. In a repository, you just put an identifier for something in another one. You can build your own chain of blocks. We actually wrote a paper called Blocks as Digital Entities, myself and my wife, that to lay the context. Went back, 70 years to the space age when they were chaining blocks for space communications, to how programming languages work with chaining blocks, to how the digital object stuff can actually support it. You can create trivially your own equivalent blockchain. You might not do it the same way that, the commercial guys are trying to do it. You might not have your own a different consensus mechanism, workflow mechanism, whatever, but you can build your own. And if I were a bank, I might say, well, I want to run my own. Why should I rely on somebody else's, especially if it's trustable and everything else? We set up a foundation in Geneva because we needed to find a way for countries that didn't trust the U.S. to be the sole architect. We were for the internet, and it led to I don't know how many years of discussions, starting with the WSIS in Geneva and then Tunis, and then all of these internet governance forums that have been carrying out to sort of get the world to say, okay, we want to play a role here. We got to, and the U.S. government eventually went along with it. They found a way to accommodate that. And they gave us some pretty good advice here as to how to go about things and do it. And that's why we set up the foundation, so we could enable some of these places that were potentially hostile to the U.S. to become part of it. Because, people travel all over the world, and so if you go somewhere and your medical record can't be read by them because they have a different medical system, and, you can't get your airplane tickets in because your network connections don't go back to where you think you need to go. It's really important to get all of that kind of sorted out. This is really an important thing. It's taken 30, 40 years, but I think the solution that we came back to that, with that and after the NOBOT stuff and the digital object stuff, is a good solution for today. It's got the same architectural principles as we invented for the internet.
Well, Dr. Kahn, I see we're coming up on our time, but I want to finish with that pre-conversation we had about the rush of your career being like whitewater canoeing. So you've been rushing all through it. Are you still in the rush now? Are you still on the rush today? Is it slowing down? Or is it just more an avalanche and we continue to see more?
Well, let me put it this way. I think the time has come for me to make a conscious decision to step away from it. Except it's hard when that's where your head is. I mean, it's like you take faculty members that want to retire from a university. It turns out retirement for them is an accounting change. They still show up at the office. They still work with students. They just don't have the same set of responsibilities. So I think what's likely to happen with me, I'm about 5 years older than Vint, and he's, I think, thinking those things as well. Although he's still active in so many things all over the globe that I don't know if he'll ever actually get there. But, sort of phase out some things and get a point where it can be more of a mentor to others. I'm happy to work with some of the universities and work with the students. I love that sort of stuff.
That's music to our ears, because there are hundreds of IEEE students and HKN students that are watching that would say, oh my gosh, I would kill to get him to say, hey, go out and get real world experience, or to get a sentence like that could be able forever to change the path.
I'll tell you one more story before we have to quit. We were asked, Vint and I were asked to do a TV series for somebody who was trying to talk about the internet. And so they set up an hour, they did the hour, it was all about ARPANET. And when he finished it, that's great, now we know all about internet. And Vint and I both said, no, you never got that. It was all about packet switching and ARPANET. He calls up his producer in New York and he gets another hour, and we agree to stay another hour. Mm-hmm. He starts by saying, 1993, when the World Wide Web started, or 92, or whenever it became, popular. Mm-hmm. And he goes on, he spends the next hour talking about the web. Mm-hmm. When we finished it, he says, now I got the story. And we said, no, you didn't. You missed the internet story, which happened between roughly mid-1970s and mid-1990s when the web came along, and it's still going on. So, it's really hard when external people are driving it. You're great here. This is a great conversation. I really appreciate it. But when external people are driving it, they drive it based on what they think they want to hear about, which isn't always what they experience.
And it's not real, and it doesn't give you the true story, and doesn't capture all the aspects and perspectives and the complexities of it, because they want to tell your story. You need to tell your story. And I hope today, Dr. Kahn, that I've allowed you to do that.
And it's more than just what happened. The more important thing is, why did it happen? And why did it happen then? And what got these folks together, and where did that come from? And, it's the behind the scenes story that really is what makes up history.
Awesome. And I'm so happy that you've shared that history with us. And I look forward to welcome you back to Boston when you receive the IEEE Medal of Honor this May. So congratulations again, and thank you so much for being here. And we look forward to seeing you in person. And we thank you all for watching today. And congratulations again, Dr. Robert Kahn, IEEE 2024 Medal of Honor recipient.
Thank you very much.